What if the biggest reason for conflict in your relationships isn't what you say, but how you say it? Most people spend years learning how to speak, yet very few learn how to communicate in a way that creates understanding, trust, and genuine connection. In this audiobook summary of Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life by Marshall Rosenberg, you will discover a powerful communication framework that has helped millions of people resolve conflicts, strengthen relationships, express themselves with confidence, and understand others on a deeper level. Whether you're struggling with arguments, misunderstandings, difficult conversations, or simply want to become a better communicator, the lessons in this book can transform the way you interact with family, friends, colleagues, and even yourself. Stay until the end, because each chapter builds on the last, and by the time you finish listening, you'll have a practical system for turning conflict into connection and conversations into opportunity for growth. Chapter 1, Giving from the Heart, introduces a central idea that communication is not just about exchanging information, it is about creating genuine human connection. Marshall Rosenberg argues that most people have been taught forms of communication that unintentionally create distance, defensiveness, and conflict. We often communicate in ways that focus on blaming, judging, criticizing, or proving that we are right. While these habits may seem normal because we see them everywhere, in families, schools, workplaces, and even on social media, they often prevent us from understanding one another. Rosenberg invites us to imagine a different way of communicating, one that comes from compassion rather than control, from understanding rather than judgment, and from a sincere desire to enrich life for ourselves and others. This is what he calls nonviolent communication, or NVC. The phrase "giving from the heart" is powerful because it shifts our focus away from winning arguments or getting our way and toward building meaningful relationships. Think about a time when someone listened to you without interrupting, criticizing, or trying to fix your problems. Chances are that interaction felt safe and comforting. You probably felt understood and valued. Now think about the opposite situation, where someone immediately judged you, dismissed your feelings, or told you why you were wrong. Even if they had good intentions, the conversation likely felt tense and unpleasant. Rosenberg's point is that human beings naturally thrive when communication is rooted in empathy and respect. One of the most important ideas in this chapter is that every human action is an attempt to meet a need. When people act kindly, they are often trying to meet needs such as connection, contribution, or love. When people act aggressively, they are still trying to meet needs, but they may be using ineffective strategies. Imagine a co-worker who constantly criticizes everyone else's work. On the surface, this person may seem rude or difficult. However, if we look deeper, we might discover that they have a strong need for competence, recognition, or security. This does not mean we should excuse harmful behavior, but it does mean we can respond with greater understanding rather than immediate judgment. Rosenberg explains that our culture often teaches us to think in terms of who is right and who is wrong. When conflict arises, many people instinctively look for someone to blame. If a project fails, we search for the person responsible. If a relationship struggles, we focus on what the other person did wrong. However, this mindset rarely solves problems. Instead, it creates defensiveness and resistance. The author encourages us to replace blame with curiosity. Rather than asking, "Who caused this problem?" we can ask, "What needs are not being met right now?" This simple shift can completely transform the quality of our conversations. Consider a common family scenario. A teenager comes home late, and the parent immediately says, "You're so irresponsible. You never think about anyone but yourself." The teenager becomes defensive and argues back. The conversation quickly turns into a fight. Using the principles introduced in this chapter, the parent might instead say, "When you came home later than expected, I felt worried because I value your safety and wanted to know you were okay." Notice the difference. The second statement does not attack the teenager's character. Instead, it honestly expresses feelings and needs. This approach increases the chances of understanding and cooperation. The chapter also challenges the idea that people can be forced into genuine cooperation through punishment, guilt, shame, or fear. While these methods may produce short-term compliance, they often damage relationships in the long run. Think about a manager who motivates employees through threats. The employees may work harder temporarily, but they are unlikely to feel engaged, creative, or loyal. Compare this to a manager who listens to employees, understands their concerns, and works with them to find solutions. The second approach creates a healthier environment because it appeals to people's willingness to contribute rather than their fear of consequences. Another fascinating concept in this chapter is that compassion is not something we need to learn from scratch. Rosenberg believes compassion is already a natural part of human nature. We can often see it in young children who instinctively want to help someone who is hurt or upset. However, as we grow older, many social systems teach us habits of judgment, competition, and domination that disconnect us from this natural compassion. Nonviolent communication is essentially a process of reconnecting with what is already within us. As you listen to this chapter, it may be helpful to reflect on your own communication habits. How often do you criticize yourself or others? How often do you assume someone's intentions without asking questions? When was the last time you truly listened to understand rather than listen to respond? These questions can reveal patterns that influence the quality of your relationships. The goal is not to judge yourself for these habits, but to become aware of them. Awareness is a first step toward change. Imagine applying these ideas in your daily life. The next time you have a disagreement with a friend, instead of trying to prove that you are right, you could focus on understanding what both of you need. The next time a family member says something hurtful, you could pause and ask yourself what feelings or unmet needs might be behind their words. The next time you make a mistake, instead of criticizing yourself harshly, you could approach yourself with the same compassion you would offer a close friend. Small changes like these can have a surprisingly powerful impact over time. At its core, Chapter 1 is an invitation to see communication differently. Instead of treating conversations as battles to be won, Rosenberg encourages us to view them as opportunities to connect, understand, and enrich life. He reminds us that beneath our differences, arguments, and misunderstandings, all human beings share common needs such as love, respect, safety, belonging, and meaning. When we learn to recognize these shared needs, communication becomes less about conflict and more about connection. This chapter lays a foundation for the rest of the book by showing that lasting change begins not with better techniques alone, but with a genuine commitment to compassion and understanding. Main points and actionable lessons. The central message of this chapter is that effective communication begins with compassion and a sincere desire to understand others rather than judge them. Human behavior is often an attempt to meet underlying needs, even when the behavior itself appears negative or harmful. Instead of focusing on blame, try to identify the unmet needs behind actions and emotions. Replace criticism with curiosity and seek connection rather than victory in conversations. Practice expressing your feelings and needs honestly without attacking or labeling others. Listen to understand rather than to prepare your response. Reflect on your daily interactions and ask yourself, am I communicating to connect, or am I communicating to control, blame, or prove that I am right? The more often you choose empathy, curiosity, and understanding, the stronger and healthier your relationships are likely to become. Chapter 2, Communication That Blocks Compassion, explores surprising and uncomfortable truth. Many of the ways we are being taught to communicate actually make understanding, empathy, and connection more difficult. Marshall Rosenberg argues that while most people genuinely want healthy relationships, they often use language patterns that create distance, defensiveness, resentment, and conflict without even realizing it. These patterns are so deeply embedded in our daily conversations that they can feel completely normal. Yet according to Rosenberg, they are among the biggest obstacles to compassionate communication. This chapter challenges readers to examine not only what they say to others, but also the hidden assumptions behind their words. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is the concept of moralistic judgments. Rosenberg explains that many people have a habit of labeling others as good or bad, right or wrong, lazy or hardworking, selfish or generous. At first glance, these labels may seem harmless or even helpful. However, they often shut down communication because they focus on judging a person's character rather than understanding their behavior and needs. Imagine a husband telling his wife, "You're always selfish." The moment those words are spoken, the conversation shifts away from understanding and toward defense. The wife is likely to argue, justify herself, or counterattack rather than genuinely listen. A simple label has transformed a potentially productive conversation into a battle. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. A manager calls an employee irresponsible because they missed a deadline. A parent calls a child lazy because they did not clean their room. A friend calls another friend inconsiderate because they forgot to return a call. While these labels may express frustration, they rarely inspire positive change. In fact, they often trigger shame, anger, or resistance. Rosenberg suggests that instead of judging people, we should focus on specific observations and the unmet need behind our reactions. Rather than saying, "You're irresponsible," a manager might say, "The project was submitted 2 days late, and I'm concerned because we need reliability to meet our commitments." This approach focuses on facts and needs rather than personal attacks. Another communication habit that blocks compassion is comparison. Rosenberg points out that many people grow up in environments where comparison is used as a motivator. Parents compare siblings, teachers compare students, employers compare workers, and individuals compare themselves to others. While society often presents comparison as a tool for improvement, Rosenberg argues it frequently creates feelings of inadequacy, jealousy, resentment, and disconnection. Imagine a student who works hard on an exam and earns a respectable grade. Instead of celebrating the achievement, they hear, "Why can't you perform like your classmate?" Suddenly, the focus shifts from growth to deficiency. Instead of feeling encouraged, the student feels diminished. This tendency to compare extends beyond childhood. Social media has amplified it dramatically. A person scrolling through their phone may compare their career to someone else's success, their appearance to someone else's photos, or their lifestyle to someone else's highlights. These comparisons often create dissatisfaction and prevent people from appreciating their own journey. Rosenberg encourages readers to recognize how comparison can disconnect us from our own needs and values. True growth comes from understanding ourselves, not from constantly measuring ourselves against others. The chapter also introduces the idea of denying responsibility. This occurs when people use language that suggests they have no choice in their actions. Phrases such as, "I had to do it," "My boss made me do it," or "I had no choice" are common examples. Rosenberg argues that while external circumstances certainly influence our decisions, we ultimately choose our actions based on the needs and values we prioritize. Denying responsibility can prevent self-awareness and reduce personal accountability. Imagine an employee who says, "I had to stay late at work because my boss demanded it." While this may feel true, Rosenberg would encourage a deeper examination. Perhaps the employee chose to stay because they value job security, financial stability, or professional growth. Recognizing this choice does not mean they enjoy staying late, but it does help them understand their motivations more clearly. This shift in thinking can be empowering because it reminds people that they are active participants in their lives rather than helpless victims of circumstances. Another fascinating point in this chapter is a distinction between requests and demands hidden beneath moral language. Many people use guilt, shame, criticism, or blame to influence others. For example, a parent might tell a child, "A good son would help his mother." A partner might say, "If you really loved me, you would do this for me." While these statements may seem persuasive, they often rely on emotional pressure rather than genuine connection. The person receiving such messages may comply, but their actions are often driven by fear, guilt, or obligation rather than willingness. Over time, this can damage trust and create resentment. Consider a hypothetical scenario involving two friends. One friend feels neglected because the other rarely calls. Instead of expressing their feelings honestly, they say, "You obviously don't care about this friendship." The accused friend becomes defensive and starts explaining why they have been busy. The real issue, the need for connection and attention, never gets discussed. The conversation becomes about defending character rather than understanding needs. Rosenberg's approach encourages people to express the underlying need directly, creating a much greater chance of mutual understanding. The chapter also highlights how language shapes perception. When we constantly categorize people as good or bad, successful or unsuccessful, intelligent or unintelligent, we stop seeing their humanity. We reduce complex individuals to simple labels. Yet every person has hopes, fears, dreams, struggles, and needs that cannot be captured by a single judgment. Compassion grows when we become curious about these deeper dimensions rather than relying on quick evaluations. As you listen to this chapter, it may be useful to reflect on your own communication patterns. How often do you use labels when describing others? Do you sometimes compare yourself to people around you? Are there situations where you tell yourself that you have no choice, even though you are making a difficult decision? Have you ever tried to motivate someone through guilt or criticism instead of honest communication? These questions are not meant to create self-criticism. They are opportunities for awareness and growth. One practical way to apply this chapter is to pause before making a judgment and ask yourself what observation, feeling, or need is hidden underneath it. The next time you think, "My coworker is lazy," ask yourself what specifically happened and what need of yours is not being met. The next time you compare yourself to someone else, ask whether that comparison is helping you grow or simply making you feel inadequate. The next time you catch yourself saying, "I had no choice," ask what values or needs influence your decision. These small shifts can dramatically improve both self-awareness and relationships. Ultimately, Chapter 2 serves as a wake-up call. It reveals how many common forms of communication create barriers to compassion, even when our intentions are good. Rosenberg challenges us to move beyond judgment, comparison, blame, and denial of responsibility, and toward a style of communication rooted in awareness, honesty, and empathy. By recognizing these harmful patterns, we take the first step toward replacing them with language that fosters understanding and connection. The chapter reminds us that compassionate communication is not just about choosing better words. It is about seeing people, including ourselves, with greater humanity and understanding. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that many common communication habits unintentionally block empathy and connection. Moralistic judgments often trigger defensiveness because they attack a person's character instead of addressing specific behaviors. Comparisons frequently create feelings of inadequacy and resentment rather than motivation. Denying responsibility prevents self-awareness and personal growth by making us feel powerless. Using guilt, shame, or criticism to influence others may produce short-term compliance but often damages relationships over time. To apply these lessons, practice replacing judgment with observations. Focus on understanding needs rather than assigning blame. Take ownership of your choices, and communicate honestly instead of relying on guilt or pressure. Ask yourself, am I trying to understand this person, or am I trying to judge them? Am I expressing a genuine need, or am I hiding it behind criticism? Am I taking responsibility for my choices, or am I pretending I have none? The more often you ask these questions, the more compassionate and effective your communication can become. Chapter 3. Observing Without Evaluating introduces what may seem like one of the simplest ideas in the entire book. Yet Marshall Rosenberg argues that it is one of the most difficult skills for human beings to master. The chapter begins with a fascinating observation. Most people believe they are describing reality objectively, but in reality, they are often mixing observations with judgments, interpretations, assumptions, and evaluations. This habit may appear harmless, but according to Rosenberg, it is one of the biggest reasons communication breaks down. When people feel judged, criticized, or labeled, they become defensive and less willing to listen. If we want to build genuine understanding and compassion, we must first learn to separate what we actually observe from the stories we tell ourselves about those observations. Imagine a husband telling his wife, "You never listened to me." At first glance, this statement may sound like a simple observation. However, if we examine it carefully, it is actually an evaluation. The word never is a judgment, not an observable fact. The wife can immediately think of several occasions when she did listen, and instead of focusing on the husband's feelings, she may start defending herself. A conversation that could have created understanding quickly turns into an argument about who is right. Now imagine if the husband said, "During our last 3 conversations, I noticed that you checked your phone while I was speaking." This statement focuses on specific observable behavior rather than a judgment. Because it is grounded in facts, it is much harder to argue with and much more likely to lead to a productive discussion. Rosenberg explains that human beings naturally create interpretations. Our minds are constantly trying to make sense of the world. This ability is useful because it helps us navigate complex situations, but it can also become a problem when we mistake our interpretation for facts. Consider a workplace example. An employee notices that their manager did not greet them in the morning. Immediately, their mind begins generating explanations. Perhaps the manager is angry. Perhaps they are disappointed in the employee's performance. Perhaps they no longer respect them. By lunchtime, the employee has convinced themselves that they are in trouble. Later, they discover that the manager was distracted by a family emergency and barely noticed anyone that morning. The employee's emotional stress was not caused by the observation itself, but by the story they attached to it. This chapter highlights an important truth about communication. Observations create connection, while judgments often create resistance. Think about how many conflicts begin with evaluations disguised as facts. A parent says, "You're lazy." A teenager hears criticism rather than understanding. A manager says, "Your attitude is terrible." An employee becomes defensive. A friend says, "You're selfish." The friendship becomes strained. In each case, the judgment overshadows a real issue. The speaker may have valid concerns, but their message becomes less effective because it triggers emotional defenses. One of the most interesting examples Rosenberg discusses is how different people can observe the same event and reach completely different conclusions. Imagine two people watching a football match. One sees a player's aggressive tackle and thinks that player is reckless. The other thinks that player is passionate and committed. The same behavior leads to two completely different evaluations. This demonstrates that evaluations often reveal more about the observer's perspective than about the event itself. Observations, on the other hand, focus on what actually happened without attaching labels or interpretations. The chapter encourages readers to develop the mindset of a curious scientist. Scientists observe phenomena before drawing conclusions. They gather evidence, pay attention to details, and remain open to multiple interpretations. Rosenberg suggests that adopting a similar approach in our relationships can dramatically improve communication. Instead of immediately labeling someone as rude, selfish, irresponsible, or inconsiderate, we can focus on what we actually saw or heard. This simple shift creates space for understanding and curiosity. Consider a hypothetical scenario involving two roommates. One roommate notices that dishes have been left in the sink for several days. If they say, "You are so lazy and inconsiderate," the conversation will likely become tense. The accused roommate may argue, make excuses, or counterattack. However, if they say, "The dishes have been in the sink since Monday, and today is Thursday," they are simply stating an observation. This creates an opportunity to discuss the issue without attacking anyone's character. The difference may seem subtle, but it can completely change the tone and outcome of the conversation. Rosenberg also points out that many people struggle to separate observation from evaluation because society often rewards quick judgments. News headlines, social media posts, and everyday conversations frequently encourage people to categorize events as good or bad, right or wrong. As a result, people become accustomed to reacting rather than observing. The challenge presented in this chapter is to slow down and pay attention to what is actually happening before rushing to conclusions. This lesson is particularly valuable in today's world, where misunderstandings can spread rapidly through text messages, emails, and social media interactions. Imagine receiving a brief message from a friend that simply says, "Okay." One person might interpret the message as angry or dismissive. Another might view it as neutral. Yet another might think the friend is busy. The reality is that the message itself contains very little information. Most of the emotional reaction comes from the interpretation added by the reader. By learning to distinguish observations from evaluations, we can avoid unnecessary stress and conflict. As you listen to this chapter, take a moment to reflect on your own communication habits. How often do you assume you know what someone else is thinking? How often do you use words like always, never, lazy, selfish, rude, or irresponsible? How many disagreements in your life are being fueled by interpretations rather than facts? Consider a recent conflict. If you stripped away all the judgments and focused only on what you directly observed, how would the story change? Would you feel differently about the situation? Would you communicate differently? One practical exercise from this chapter is to practice translating judgments into observations. If you catch yourself thinking, "My colleague is unreliable," ask yourself what specific behavior led you to that conclusion. Did they miss 3 deadlines this month? Did they fail to return important calls? By identifying the observable facts, you become better equipped to communicate clearly and constructively. Similarly, when evaluating yourself, try replacing harsh labels with observations. Instead of saying, "I'm a failure," focus on the specific outcome that disappointed you. This approach encourages learning rather than self-criticism. Ultimately, Chapter 3 teaches that observation without evaluation is the foundation of compassionate communication. Before we can express feelings, identify needs, or make requests, we must first see reality as clearly as possible. By separating fact from interpretations, we create conversations that are less defensive, more honest, and far more likely to lead to understanding. Rosenberg reminds us that while judgments may feel natural, they often prevent us from seeing people as they truly are. Observation, on the other hand, opens a door to curiosity, empathy, and genuine human connection. The ability to observe without evaluating is not just communication skill. It is a way of seeing the world that can transform relationships, reduce conflict, and bring greater clarity to everyday life. Main points and actionable lessons. The core lesson of this chapter is that effective communication begins with observing facts without immediately adding judgments or interpretations. Many conflicts arise because people confuse evaluations with observations and present opinions as objective reality. Words such as always, never, lazy, selfish, rude, and irresponsible often trigger defensiveness because they label people rather than describe behavior. To apply this lesson, practice identifying specific observable actions instead of making character judgments. When you feel upset, ask yourself what you actually saw or heard before creating a story about it. In conversations, focus on facts rather than assumptions. Reflect on questions such as, am I describing what happened or am I interpreting it? What evidence supports my conclusion? Could there be another explanation for this behavior? By consistently separating observations from evaluations, you can communicate more clearly, reduce misunderstandings, and build stronger, more compassionate relationships. Chapter 4, Identifying and Expressing Feelings, explores a skill that sounds simple but is surprisingly difficult for many people, recognizing what we are truly feeling and expressing those feelings honestly. Marshall Rosenberg argues that one of the greatest barriers to meaningful communication is that most people have lost touch with their emotional world. From a young age, many of us are taught to focus on what is right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable, successful or unsuccessful, but very few of us are taught how to identify and communicate our feelings. As a result, people often go through life experiencing emotions without fully understanding them, and when conflict arises, they tend to express judgments, accusations, or opinions instead of revealing what is actually happening inside them. This chapter invites readers to reconnect with their feelings and discover how emotional honesty can transform relationships, reduce misunderstandings, and create deeper human connections. Rosenberg begins by highlighting a common pattern in communication. When people are upset, they often describe what is wrong with others instead of expressing what they feel. Imagine a husband who comes home after a long day and notices that dinner is not ready. Instead of saying, I feel disappointed because I was looking forward to eating together, he says, you never care about anyone but yourself. The statement sounds like communication, but it is actually criticism disguised as communication. The listener hears an attack rather than an invitation to understand. The real feeling remains hidden, and the conversation quickly turns into an argument. Rosenberg's key insight is that when we express judgments, we often create distance, but when we express feelings, we create opportunities for connection. One of the reasons this skill is so challenging is that many people confuse feelings with thoughts. For example, someone might say, I feel ignored, I feel misunderstood, or I feel unimportant. While these phrases seem like expressions of emotion, they often contain interpretations of another person's behavior rather than pure feelings. Rosenberg encourages readers to dig deeper. Instead of saying, I feel ignored, a person might say, I feel lonely, I feel sad, or I feel disappointed. These words describe genuine emotions rather than assumptions about someone else's intentions. This distinction may seem small, but it can dramatically improve communication because it reduces blame and increases vulnerability. Consider a real-life workplace example. An employee spends weeks preparing a presentation and receives very little feedback from their manager. The employee thinks, my boss doesn't appreciate me. As frustration builds, they may become resentful or disengaged. However, if they pause and identify their actual feelings, they might realize they feel discouraged, disappointed, or uncertain. Once they understand these emotions, they can communicate more effectively. Instead of accusing the manager of being unappreciative, they can express their feelings and explain their need for recognition and feedback. This approach is much more likely to lead to understanding and constructive dialogue. The chapter also explores how society often discourages emotional expression. Many people grow up hearing messages such as don't cry, be strong, stop being so sensitive, or keep your emotions to yourself. Over time, these messages teach people to suppress or ignore their feelings. Some individuals become so disconnected from their emotional experiences that they struggle to identify what they are feeling at all. Rosenberg argues that this emotional disconnection comes at a significant cost. When people cannot recognize their feelings, they lose access to valuable information about their needs, values, and well-being. Imagine a person who feels constantly exhausted and irritable. They might assume they simply have a bad attitude or that life is inherently stressful. However, if they take time to explore their feelings, they may discover that they are overwhelmed, unsupported, or burned out. These feelings point to unmet needs such as rest, balance, or support. Without emotional awareness, the person continues suffering without understanding why. With emotional awareness, they gain insight into what needs to change. Rosenberg emphasizes that feelings are not weaknesses. In many cultures, emotional expression is sometimes viewed as a sign of vulnerability or lack of control. However, he argues that the opposite is true. It takes courage to acknowledge feelings honestly, especially in situations where we fear judgment or rejection. Imagine a father who tells his teenage son, "I feel worried when you stay out late because I care about your safety." This statement requires vulnerability. The father is revealing his emotions rather than hiding behind anger or authority. While the conversation may still be challenging, it is more likely to foster understanding than if the father simply yelled or imposed punishment. The chapter also introduces the idea that feelings are universal. While people's experiences differ, emotions such as joy, sadness, fear, excitement, disappointment, and gratitude are shared across cultures and backgrounds. This universality creates opportunities for empathy. When someone expresses genuine feelings, others are more likely to relate to them. Consider two friends discussing a disagreement. If one says, "You're selfish and inconsiderate," the other may become defensive. But if they say, "I felt hurt and disappointed when our plans were canceled because I was looking forward to spending time together," the conversation becomes much more human. The listener may not agree with every detail, but they can understand the emotion. Another fascinating aspect of this chapter is a connection between feelings and self-awareness. Many people move through life reacting automatically to events without stopping to examine their emotional responses. Someone receives criticism and immediately becomes angry. Someone experiences rejection and immediately feels hopeless. Someone encounters a setback and immediately feels defeated. Rosenberg encourages readers to slow down and become curious about their feelings rather than being controlled by them. Emotions are not enemies to be conquered. They are signals that provide valuable information about what matters to us. As you listen to this chapter, consider your own relationship with feelings. How comfortable are you expressing emotions honestly? Do you tend to hide sadness behind anger? Do you suppress disappointment to avoid appearing vulnerable? When someone asks how you are doing, do you provide a genuine answer or an automatic response? Think about a recent conflict in your life. What emotions were present beneath the surface? Were you truly angry, or were you actually hurt, scared, lonely, or disappointed? These questions can reveal insights that dramatically improve both self-understanding and communication. One practical way to apply this chapter is to expand your emotional vocabulary. Instead of describing every unpleasant emotion as anger or stress, try identifying more specific feelings such as frustrated, discouraged, anxious, embarrassed, overwhelmed, or disappointed. Similarly, instead of describing positive experiences simply as happiness, explore emotions such as grateful, inspired, relieved, excited, hopeful, or content. The more accurately you identify your feelings, the more effectively you can communicate your experiences and understand your needs. Imagine waking up tomorrow and approaching every interaction with greater emotional awareness. Instead of reacting impulsively, you pause and ask yourself, "What am I feeling right now?" Before criticizing someone, you identify the emotions underneath your frustration. Before withdrawing from a difficult conversation, you acknowledge your fears or insecurities. These small moments of awareness can create profound changes in relationships because they replace blame with honesty and defensiveness with connection. Ultimately, Chapter 4 teaches that feelings are not obstacles to communication. They are the bridge to authentic connection. When we learn to recognize and express our emotions honestly, we invite others into our inner world. We stop hiding behind judgments, labels, and accusations and begin sharing our genuine human experience. Rosenberg reminds us that compassionate communication starts with self-awareness. By understanding our feelings, we gain insight into our needs, values, and desires, and we create opportunities for deeper empathy and understanding with those around us. This chapter serves as a powerful reminder that emotional honesty is not a weakness, but one of the greatest strengths we can develop. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that identifying and expressing feelings honestly is essential for compassionate communication and meaningful relationships. Many people hide their emotions behind judgment, criticism, or assumptions, which creates misunderstanding and conflict. Feelings are different from thoughts and interpretations, and learning to distinguish between them improves clarity and connection. Emotional awareness helps us understand our needs and respond more thoughtfully to challenges. To apply this chapter, practice naming your feelings more specifically throughout the day, and notice when you are expressing judgments instead of emotions. Before reacting in a conflict, ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? What need might be connected to this feeling? Am I expressing my emotions honestly, or am I hiding them behind criticism or blame? By becoming more aware of your emotional experiences and communicating them openly, you can build stronger relationships, increase self-understanding, and create more compassionate interactions in every area of your life. Chapter 5, Taking Responsibility for Our Feelings, presents one of the most transformative and, at first, controversial ideas in the entire book. Marshall Rosenberg challenges a belief that many of us have accepted without question for most of our lives, the idea that other people cause our feelings. We often hear phrases like, "You made me angry," "She hurt my feelings," "My boss stresses me out," or "My children drive me crazy." These statements are so common that they seem completely normal. Yet Rosenberg argues that they are fundamentally inaccurate. According to Nonviolent Communication, other people's actions may trigger our emotions, but they do not directly cause them. The true source of our feelings lies deeper in our own needs, values, expectations, and interpretations. This distinction may seem subtle, but understanding it can dramatically change the way we handle conflict, relationships, and emotional challenges. To understand this concept, imagine two employees receiving the exact same criticism from their manager. The manager says, "Your report needs significant improvement." One employee feels devastated, interpreting the comment as proof that they are incompetent. The other employee feels motivated, seeing it as an opportunity to learn and grow. The same words were spoken to both people, yet they experience entirely different emotional reactions. If words alone cause feelings, both employees would have felt exactly the same way. Rosenberg uses examples like this to show that our emotions are influenced not only by external events, but also by how those events relate to our needs, beliefs, and perspectives. The chapter introduces a powerful idea. When someone says or does something we dislike, we have several possible ways to respond. One common reaction is to blame ourselves. Imagine a student who receives a poor grade and immediately thinks, "I'm stupid. I'll never succeed." Instead of examining what happened objectively, they attack themselves. Another common reaction is to blame others. A person whose partner forgets an important anniversary might immediately think, "You're selfish and don't care about me." In this case, responsibility for the emotional pain is placed entirely on the other person. Rosenberg argues that both approaches disconnect us from what is actually happening inside us. The more compassionate and empowering approach is to recognize our feelings and connect them to our unmet needs. In the anniversary example, instead of accusing the partner of being selfish, the person might recognize that they feel hurt, disappointed, or lonely because they have a need for appreciation, connection, or acknowledgement. This shift changes the entire nature of the conversation. Instead of attacking the other person, they are expressing something vulnerable and authentic. The focus moves away from blame and toward understanding. Consider a real-life family scenario. A father spends weeks planning a special outing with his teenage son. On the day of the event, the son says he would rather spend time with friends. The father immediately feels upset. Many people in this situation would react by saying, "You don't appreciate anything I do for you." While this statement communicates frustration, it also contains blame and judgment. Rosenberg would encourage the father to look deeper. Perhaps the father feels disappointed because he has a strong need for connection and quality time with his son. When he understands this need, he can communicate more honestly and effectively. He might say, "I feel disappointed because I was really looking forward to spending time together." This expression invites understanding instead of defensiveness. One of the most eye-opening lessons in this chapter is that feelings are messengers. They provide information about whether our needs are being met or unmet. Pleasant feelings such as joy, excitement, gratitude, and contentment often indicate that important needs are being fulfilled. Unpleasant feelings such as frustration, sadness, fear, disappointment, or loneliness often signal that certain needs are not being met. Rather than viewing emotions as problems to eliminate, Rosenberg encourages readers to see them as valuable sources of information. Imagine a woman who constantly feels exhausted and irritated at work. She initially blames her co-workers, her workload, and her schedule. While these factors may contribute to her experience, deeper reflection reveals that she has a strong need for balance, rest, and support. Once she recognizes these unmet needs, she can begin exploring solutions. Without this awareness, she might remain trapped in a cycle of blame and frustration. The chapter also explores how cultural conditioning influences our relationship with feelings. Many people are taught to prioritize pleasing others over understanding their own needs. They learn to feel responsible for other people's emotions while simultaneously believing that others are responsible for theirs. For example, a person might agree to attend an event they do not want to attend because they fear disappointing a friend. Later, they feel resentful and blame the friend for making them go. Rosenberg challenges this mindset by reminding readers that every decision involves a choice. Recognizing that we choose our actions based on the needs we are trying to meet can increase both honesty and personal responsibility. A particularly interesting example involves parenting. Imagine a mother telling her child, "You make me so angry when you leave your toys on the floor." While many parents have said something similar, Rosenberg would suggest a different approach. The mother's anger is not caused directly by the toys. Instead, her anger is connected to needs such as order, cooperation, or ease in maintaining the household. By understanding and expressing these needs, she can communicate more clearly and effectively. This does not mean ignoring problematic behavior. Rather, it means addressing it without placing total responsibility for one's emotions on another person. The chapter invites readers to become emotional detectives. Instead of asking, "Who is to blame for how I feel?" Rosenberg encourages a different question. What need of mine is connected to this feeling? This simple shift can transform relationships because it reduces accusations and increases self-awareness. When people understand their own needs, they are better equipped to communicate them clearly and find constructive solutions. As you listen to this chapter, think about a recent situation where you felt upset. Perhaps a friend canceled plans, a co-worker criticized your work, or a family member said something hurtful. How did you explain your emotions to yourself? Did you focus entirely on what the other person did wrong, or did you explore the needs behind your feelings? What unmet need might have been present? Was it a need for respect, appreciation, connection, security, support, understanding, or trust? These questions can reveal insights that are often hidden beneath the surface of emotional reactions. One practical application of this chapter is to pause whenever strong emotions arise and complete the sentence. I feel underscore 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 because I need underscore 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 underscore. For example, I feel frustrated because I need clarity. I feel lonely because I need connection. Or I feel anxious because I need security. This exercise helps shift attention away from blame and towards self-awareness. Over time, it becomes easier to understand emotions as signals rather than problems. Imagine how different your relationships might become if you consistently took responsibility for your feelings. Instead of accusing others, you would express your emotions honestly. Instead of waiting for people to guess your needs, you would communicate them clearly. Instead of seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances, you would recognize your ability to understand and respond to your own emotional experiences. This approach does not remove life's challenges, but it changes the way you navigate them. Ultimately, Chapter 5 teaches that emotional responsibility is not about blaming ourselves or ignoring the actions of others. It is about recognizing that our feelings are connected to our needs, values, and interpretations. By taking responsibility for our emotions, we gain greater freedom, self-awareness, and emotional maturity. Rosenberg shows that when we stop searching for someone to blame and start exploring what our feelings are telling us, we open the door to healthier relationships, deeper understanding, and more compassionate communication. This chapter marks a major turning point in the book because it shifts the focus from changing other people to understanding ourselves, and that shift has the power to transform every area of life. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that other people's actions may trigger our emotions, but our feelings are ultimately connected to our own needs, values, expectations, and interpretations. Blaming ourselves or blaming others often prevents us from understanding what is really happening inside us. Feelings are valuable signals that point toward met or unmet needs. To apply this lesson, practice identifying the needs behind your emotions instead of focusing immediately on who is at fault. When strong emotions arise, ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What need of mine is connected to this feeling? Am I blaming someone else instead of understanding myself? Try using statements such as, I feel disappointed because I need connection, or I feel frustrated because I need clarity. By taking responsibility for your feelings and expressing them honestly, you can reduce conflict, communicate more effectively, and develop greater emotional awareness and resilience in everyday life. Chapter 6. Requesting that which would enrich life takes everything we have learned so far about observations, feelings, and needs, and transforms it into a practical skill that can change the outcome of almost every conversation we have in life, the ability to make clear, respectful, and effective requests. Marshall Rosenberg emphasizes that many people know how to complain, demand, hint, or criticize, but very few people know how to ask for what they truly want in a way that increases the likelihood of cooperation and understanding. This chapter is not about manipulation or getting people to obey. Instead, it is about expressing our needs in such a clear and honest way that others can choose to respond willingly, from understanding rather than pressure. The chapter begins by highlighting a common communication failure that happens in everyday life. Imagine a couple at home after a long day. One partner feels exhausted and wants support but says, "You never help me around the house." The other partner immediately becomes defensive, thinking about all the times they did help. The conversation quickly turns into an argument about who is right. Now imagine a different approach. Instead of blaming, the partner says, "I feel overwhelmed and would really appreciate some help with cleaning up the kitchen tonight." The second version is not only clearer, but also gives a specific action that the other person can respond to. This shift from complaint to request is at the heart of nonviolent communication. Rosenberg explains that most conflicts arise not because people are unwilling to cooperate, but because they do not understand what is being requested of them. Vague language such as be more supportive, care more, or be responsible often leads to confusion because these phrases do not describe specific actions. For example, if a manager tells an employee, "I want you to be more proactive," the employee may not know what exactly to do differently. However, if the manager says, "I would like you to send me a summary of your progress every Friday," the request becomes concrete and actionable. Clarity removes ambiguity and increases the chance of cooperation. One of the most important distinctions in this chapter is the difference between a request and a demand. A request respects the other person's freedom to say no, while a demand implies consequences, pressure, or punishment if the request is not fulfilled. Imagine a parent telling a child, "If you really loved me, you would clean your room." Even if the child complies, it is likely motivated by guilt or fear rather than genuine willingness. Now imagine the parent saying, "Would you be willing to clean your room before dinner so we can all relax together afterward?" In the second case, the child has the freedom to respond, and the communication is based on cooperation rather than control. Rosenberg emphasizes that true connection cannot be built through coercion, it grows through voluntary contribution. The chapter also explores how unclear requests often lead to disappointment in relationships. For example, a person might say to a friend, "You never spend time with me anymore," hoping the friend will understand the need for connection. However, the friend may not know what specific action is expected. Do they want a phone call once a week? A coffee meetup? A message check-in? Without clarity, even caring people can fail to respond appropriately. When requests are not specific, people are left guessing, and guessing often leads to misunderstanding. Consider a real-life workplace scenario. An employee feels stressed because their workload is overwhelming. Instead of telling their manager, "I can't handle this anymore," which is vague and emotionally charged, they might say, "Would it be possible to prioritize my tasks and delay the lower priority assignments so I can focus on the most urgent work this week?" This request is clear, respectful, and solution-oriented. It gives the manager a real opportunity to respond constructively. The difference between these two approaches can determine whether the conversation leads to conflict or cooperation. Rosenberg also emphasizes the importance of making requests in positive action language rather than vague or negative terms. Saying, "Don't ignore me," is not as effective as saying, "Could you please let me know when you are busy so I know when we can talk?" The first statement focuses on what you do not want, while the second clearly describes what you do want. Positive language helps the listener understand exactly what action is expected, which reduces confusion and increases the likelihood of a successful outcome. Another powerful insight in this chapter is that effective requests are always open to feedback. After making a request, it is important to check whether the other person truly understood it and whether they are willing to fulfill it. Imagine asking a friend, "Would you be willing to review my presentation before tomorrow?" If they agree, you might follow up by asking, "Could you tell me what you understood I was asking for?" This ensures clarity and prevents misunderstandings. Rosenberg encourages us to see communication as a two-way process, not a one-sided instruction. The chapter also highlights how fear of rejection often prevents people from making clear requests. Many individuals avoid asking directly because they fear hearing no. As a result, they resort to hints, sarcasm, or silent expectations. For example, instead of asking a partner for emotional support, someone might act distant or upset, hoping the partner will notice. When the partner fails to respond, frustration grows. Rosenberg explains that indirect communication rarely leads to understanding. Clear requests, even when they are not always accepted, create honesty and reduce emotional confusion. As you listen to this chapter, reflect on how often you express your needs indirectly. Think about a recent situation where you felt disappointed. Did you clearly ask for what you wanted, or did you expect the other person to guess? If you could replay that situation, how would you phrase your request differently? What specific action would you have asked for instead of expressing frustration or blame? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice transforming vague statements into clear requests. Instead of saying, "I want more respect," try identify what respect looks like in behavior. Does it mean being listened to without interruption? Does it mean receiving timely responses to messages? Does it mean being spoken to in a calm tone? When you define the behavior clearly, your request becomes easier to understand and respond to. Similarly, in personal relationships, instead of saying, "Spend more time with me," you might say, "Would you be willing to have dinner together twice a week so we can stay connected?" This level of clarity reduces misunderstandings and increases emotional satisfaction. Imagine how different your relationships would feel if you consistently express your needs clearly and respectfully. Instead of feeling ignored or misunderstood, you would feel heard because others actually know what you want. Instead of building resentment through unspoken expectations, you would create transparency. Instead of hoping people read your mind, you would engage in direct, honest communication that respects both your needs and their freedom. Ultimately, Chapter 6 teaches that requesting what would enrich life is not about demanding, controlling, or manipulating others. It is about expressing our needs in a way that invites understanding and voluntary cooperation. Rosenberg shows that when we combine clear observations, honest feelings, and awareness of need with precise requests, we create communication that is both powerful and compassionate. This chapter reminds us that clarity is kindness, and that the more clearly we express what we need, the more likely we are to build relationships based on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that effective communication requires making clear, specific, and positive requests that describe exactly what we want rather than what we do not want. Vague complaints, hints, and demands often lead to confusion, defensiveness, or resentment, while clear requests increase the chances of cooperation and understanding. A request is different from a demand because it allows the other person the freedom to say no. To apply this chapter, practice turning emotional reactions and complaints into specific actions you can ask for. Instead of saying, "You never help me," try, "Would you be willing to help me with the dishes tonight?" Instead of, "I want more attention," try, "Could we spend 20 minutes talking after dinner each day?" Reflect on questions such as, am I clearly expressing what I need, or am I hoping others will guess it? Is my request specific and actionable? Am I respecting the other person's freedom to respond? By making your communication clearer and more respectful, you can reduce misunderstandings, improve cooperation, and create stronger and more fulfilling relationships in every area of your life. Chapter 7. Receiving empathically shifts the focus of nonviolent communication from expressing ourselves clearly to something even more challenging and transformative, which is learning how to truly listen to others without judgment, interruption, or the urge to fix, defend, or advise. Marshall Rosenberg emphasizes that most people believe they are good listeners, but in reality, they often listen in order to respond rather than to understand. In everyday conversations, while someone is speaking, many of us are already preparing our reply, forming arguments, or thinking about how to correct what we hear. This chapter invites us to slow down and listen in a completely different way, one that is centered on empathy, presence, and genuine curiosity about the other person's inner world. Rosenberg explains that empathic listening is not about agreeing with everything someone says or taking responsibility for their feelings. Instead, it is about fully understanding their emotions and need without immediately reacting. Imagine a friend coming to you after a difficult day and saying, "My boss is impossible. I can't work like this anymore." The typical reaction might be to give advice such as, "You should just talk to HR," or to share your own experience by saying, "My boss is worse than yours." While these responses may come from a place of care, they often shift the focus away from the speaker's feelings. In contrast, empathic listening would involve staying present and reflecting back what you hear at the level of feelings and needs, such as sensing that your friend feels frustrated, overwhelmed, and possibly unappreciated in their work environment. The chapter highlights that one of the most powerful forms of empathy is simply being fully present with another person's emotions without trying to fix them. Consider a child who comes home from school crying because a classmate was unkind. A parent might instinctively say, "Don't worry about it, it doesn't matter," or just ignore them. However, what the child often needs in that moment is not a solution but understanding. If the parent instead listens attentively and says something like, "It sounds like you felt really hurt when that happened," the child feels seen and validated. This simple act of empathic reflection can often bring more comfort than any advice or solution. Rosenberg emphasizes that empathy requires us to temporarily set aside our own thoughts, opinions, and judgments. This can be surprisingly difficult because our minds are constantly active. When someone shares a problem, we may quickly start thinking about what they did wrong, how we would handle the situation, or why they shouldn't feel that way. However, empathic listening asks us to quiet those internal reactions and instead focus on what the other person might be feeling and needing in that moment. This does not mean ignoring our own perspective. It simply means prioritizing understanding before responding. Imagine a workplace scenario where an employee is upset because their efforts were not acknowledged in a team meeting. They might say to a colleague, "I worked so hard on that project and no one even mentioned it." A typical response might be, "You shouldn't take it personally," or "At least the project went well." While these responses aim to reduce tension, they often dismiss the person's feelings. Empathic listening would sound more like, "Are you feeling disappointed because you were hoping for recognition for your contribution?" This response shows that you are truly trying to understand their emotional experience rather than dismiss it. The chapter also explores a common misconception about empathy, the idea that we need to have the right words to be supportive. Rosenberg argues that empathy is not about saying the perfect sentence, but about your intention to understand. Even silence, when offered with genuine presence and attention, can be deeply comforting. Think of a situation where someone is grieving a loss. In such moments, long explanations or advice may feel intrusive. Simply sitting with them, acknowledging their pain with your presence, and allowing them to express themselves can be more powerful than any carefully crafted response. Another important idea in this chapter is that empathy is not a one-time technique but a continuous process. People often experience shifting emotions during a conversation. For example, someone may begin by expressing anger but gradually reveal sadness or fear underneath. Rosenberg encourages listeners to stay engaged and continue reflecting feelings and needs as they evolve. This requires patience and a willingness to remain present even when conversations become emotionally intense or uncomfortable. Consider a hypothetical family disagreement. A teenager tells their parent, "You never understand me." The parent might initially feel defensive and want to argue. However, if they choose empathy instead, they might respond by saying, "Are you feeling frustrated because you want to feel understood?" This shift changes the entire tone of the interaction. Instead of escalating conflict, it opens a space for deeper communication where the teenager feels heard and is more likely to continue sharing honestly. The chapter also reveals an important truth about human connection. People are more likely to open up when they feel genuinely heard. When someone experiences empathic listening, they often naturally soften their emotional intensity. This is because being understood meets a deep psychological need for connection and validation. Rosenberg explains that empathy does not require solving problems or offering solutions. In many cases, understanding alone is enough to create relief and clarity. As you listen to this chapter, reflect on your own listening habits. When someone is speaking to you, do you focus on understanding their emotions, or are you preparing your response? Do you tend to interrupt with advice, comparisons, or judgments? How often do people leave conversations with you feeling truly heard? Think about a recent interaction where someone shared something personal. Did you respond in a way that deepened understanding, or did the conversation shift towards solutions or opinions? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice silent empathy in your daily conversations. The next time someone speaks to you about a problem, try resisting the urge to respond immediately. Instead, pause and focus on identifying what they might be feeling and needing. You might reflect back gently by saying things like, "It sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed," or "Are you feeling disappointed because something didn't go as you expected?" Even if you are not perfect in your wording, the intention to understand will be felt by the other person. Another powerful exercise is to listen without preparing your response. Instead of thinking about what you will say next, focus entirely on the speaker's words, tone, and emotions. Imagine that your only goal is to understand their experience as fully as possible. This simple shift can dramatically improve the quality of your relationships because it creates a space where people feel safe to express themselves honestly. Ultimately, Chapter 7 teaches that empathic listening is one of the most powerful forms of communication because it meets a fundamental human need, the need to be understood. Rosenberg shows that when we listen with empathy, we do not just hear words, we connect with the feelings and needs behind those words. This kind of listening has the power to diffuse conflict, deepen relationships, and create emotional safety in any interaction. The chapter reminds us that before we try to be understood, we must first learn to understand others fully. When people feel heard, they naturally become more open, cooperative, and connected, making empathy not just a communication skill but a foundation for meaningful human relationships. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that empathic listening means fully understanding another person's feelings and needs without judgment, interruption, or immediately offering solutions. Most communication problems arise because people listen to respond rather than to understand. True empathy requires presence, patience, and a willingness to set aside our own thoughts temporarily. To apply this chapter, practice listening without interrupting, avoid giving advice too quickly, and reflect back the speaker's emotions instead of analyzing or judging them. When someone speaks to you, ask yourself, what might they be feeling right now? What might they need? Am I truly listening, or am I preparing my response? By focusing on understanding rather than reacting, you can create deeper trust, reduce conflict, and make others feel genuinely seen and valued in your daily life. Chapter 8, The Power of Empathy, goes deeper into one of the most transformative ideas in nonviolent communication, showing that empathy is not just a polite social skill or way to make conversations smoother, but a powerful force that can completely change the emotional direction of a human interaction. Marshall Rosenberg emphasizes that empathy has the ability to dissolve anger, reduce tension, and create deep emotional connection even in situations that initially seem impossible to resolve. At its core, this chapter reveals that when people feel truly understood, something remarkable happens. Their emotional intensity begins to soften, not because their problem is solved, but because their need to be heard and acknowledged is being met. The chapter begins by challenging a common assumption that many people carry, which is that strong emotions such as anger, frustration, or blame must be corrected, debated, or countered. In everyday life, when someone is upset, the natural reaction is often to defend ourselves, explain our side, or correct their perception. For example, imagine a situation where a colleague angrily says, "You completely ruined the project with your mistake." The immediate instinct might be to argue back and justify your actions. However, Rosenberg explains that responding defensively often escalates the conflict. Instead, If we respond with empathy by trying to understand the feelings and need behind the anger, the situation can shift dramatically. A response such as, "Are you feeling frustrated because a project outcome is important to you and you needed it to go smoothly?" can create space for calm and understanding rather than confrontation. One of the most powerful insights in this chapter is that empathy is not about agreement. You do not need to accept, blame, or approve of someone's judgment in order to understand their feelings. Instead, empathy is about recognizing the human needs beneath the emotions. Imagine a parent whose teenager comes home late and yells, "You never trust me, you treat me like a child." A defensive response might focus on rules or discipline, but an empathic response would try to understand what is underneath the anger. The parent might say, "Are you feeling frustrated because you want more independence and trust?" This simple shift can transform a heated argument into a meaningful conversation about needs and expectations. Rosenberg explains that empathy works because it addresses a fundamental human need, the need to be understood. When people are in emotional distress, they are often not looking for advice or solutions first. They are looking for connection. Consider a friend who is going through a breakup. If you immediately say, "You'll find someone better," or "It's not a big deal," the friend may feel dismissed. But if you sit with them and say, "It sounds like you're feeling really hurt and maybe even lonely because a relationship meant a lot to you," you are giving them something far more valuable than advice. You are giving them understanding, and that understanding often brings more relief than any solution. The chapter also explores how empathy can transform situations that initially feel hostile or impossible. Imagine a customer service situation where a customer is shouting at an employee because their order was delayed. The employee might initially feel attacked or unfairly blamed. However, if the employee chooses to listen empathically instead of reacting defensively, they might respond by saying, "It sounds like you're really frustrated because you were expecting your order earlier and this delay has caused inconvenience." This acknowledgement does not necessarily solve the logistical problem immediately, but it often reduces the emotional intensity of the situation, making it easier to find a practical solution afterward. Rosenberg highlights that empathy is not something that requires perfect words or formal training. It is more about presence and intention. Even if your response is not perfectly phrased, the other person can still feel whether you are genuinely trying to understand them or simply waiting for your turn to speak. This is why empathy is described as a quality of presence rather than a technique. In many cases, people remember how they felt in your presence more than what you actually said. Another important idea in this chapter is that empathy is especially powerful in moments of conflict. When emotions are high, logic alone rarely works. People are not in a state where they can calmly analyze arguments or explanations. Instead, they are in a state where they want their emotional experience acknowledged. Think about a couple in an argument where one partner says, "You never help me with anything around the house." A typical response might be to list all the times help was provided, but that rarely resolves the emotional tension. An empathic response, such as, "Are you feeling overwhelmed because you need more support at home?" addresses the emotional root of the conflict and opens the door for collaboration rather than debate. The chapter also emphasizes that empathy does not mean losing yourself or ignoring your own needs. Many people fear that if they deeply understand others, they will become emotionally drained or taken advantage of. However, Rosenberg clarifies that empathy actually strengthens relationships by creating mutual understanding. When both people feel heard, the likelihood of cooperation increases significantly. Empathy is not self-sacrifice, it is mutual recognition. As you listen to this chapter, reflect on how you typically respond when someone expresses strong emotions toward you. Do you become defensive, try to fix a problem immediately, or withdraw from the conversation? How often do you pause to consider what the other person might be feeling beneath their words? Think about a recent disagreement in your life. If you had responded with empathy instead of reaction, how might the outcome have changed? What feelings or needs might the other person have been trying to express? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice what Rosenberg calls listening for feelings and needs. When someone speaks to you, especially in moments of emotional intensity, try to focus less on the surface words and more on the underlying emotions. Ask yourself what the person might be feeling and what they might be needing. Then reflect that understanding back to them in simple language. Even if you are not perfectly accurate, the effort to understand often creates immediate emotional relief for the other person. Another useful practice is to slow down your responses during conflict. Instead of reacting instantly, Take a moment to breathe and ask internally, what is this person feeling right now? This small pause can completely change the direction of a conversation from confrontation to connection. Ultimately, Chapter 8 teaches that empathy is one of the most powerful tools for human connection because it meets the deepest emotional need we all share, the need to be understood. Rosenberg shows that empathy is not about fixing people, correcting them, or agreeing with them, but about being fully present with their experience. When people feel truly heard, their defenses soften, their emotions become more manageable, and meaningful dialogue becomes possible. This chapter reinforces the idea that empathy is not just a communication technique, but a transformative approach to human relationships that can reduce conflict, build trust, and create emotional safety in even the most difficult interactions. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that empathy has the power to transform emotional tension by helping people feel understood rather than judged or corrected. Strong emotions often soften when individuals feel their feelings and needs are truly acknowledged. Empathy is not about agreeing with others, but about connecting with their emotional experience. To apply this chapter, practice responding to emotional statements by identifying feelings and needs instead of reacting defensively or offering immediate solutions. When someone is upset, ask yourself, what might they be feeling? What might they need right now? Am I responding with understanding or with defense? By consistently choosing empathy over reaction, you can reduce conflict, deepen relationships, and create more meaningful and peaceful communication in your everyday life. Chapter 9. Connecting compassionately with ourselves shifts the focus of nonviolent communication inward and explores one of the most overlooked but essential aspects of emotional intelligence, how we treat ourselves when we make mistakes, feel overwhelmed, or fall short of our own expectations. Marshall Rosenberg explains that many people are surprisingly skilled at showing empathy to others, but extremely harsh and judgmental toward themselves. While we may offer understanding and kindness to friends, family members, or even strangers, we often turn inward with criticism, guilt, and self-blame when something goes wrong in our own lives. This chapter invites readers to transform that internal dialogue and develop a more compassionate relationship with themselves, which ultimately becomes a foundation for healthier relationships with others. Rosenberg begins by pointing out that the way we talk to ourselves internally often mirrors the language of external judgment that we have learned from society. When someone makes a mistake, their internal voice might say, "I'm so stupid," "I always mess things up," or "I should have known better." These statements may feel like motivation or accountability, but in reality, they often create shame and emotional distance from ourselves. Imagine a student who fails an important exam. Instead of reflecting on what they could improve, they immediately conclude, "I'm not smart enough for this subject." This internal judgment does not encourage learning, it discourages growth. The student becomes discouraged, anxious, and less likely to try again with confidence. The chapter explains that connecting compassionately with ourselves means treating our own emotions and needs with the same understanding we would offer to someone we care about deeply. Consider a person who forgets an important appointment with a friend. The immediate reaction might be intense self-criticism. "I'm so irresponsible, I can't do anything right." However, Rosenberg encourages a different approach. Instead of attacking oneself, the person can pause and ask, "What was I feeling at that moment? What need was I trying to meet? What led me to forget?" Perhaps they were overwhelmed, stressed, or distracted by multiple responsibilities. When we explore our actions through the lens of needs rather than judgment, we begin to understand ourselves rather than punish ourselves. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is that self-compassion is not self-indulgence. Many people fear that if they stop criticizing themselves, they will lose motivation or become lazy. However, Rosenberg argues the opposite. Harsh self-judgment often leads to shame and avoidance, while self-compassion creates clarity and willingness to improve. Imagine two employees who both receive critical feedback from their manager. One responds with harsh self-talk, thinking, "I'm terrible at my job." This employee may become anxious and disengaged. The other responds with self-compassion, thinking, "I feel disappointed because I value doing good work, and I want to understand what I can learn from this." This second response leads to growth, improvement, and resilience. The chapter also explores how many people are conditioned to believe that they must earn self-worth through performance. From a young age, individuals may be praised for success and criticized for failure, which creates a belief that their value depends on achievement. Rosenberg challenges this belief by emphasizing that human worth is not conditional. Mistakes do not define identity. They simply provide information about unmet needs or areas for learning. A person who misses a deadline, for example, is not a failure, but someone who may have been overwhelmed, disorganized, or lacking support at that moment. This shift in perspective allows individuals to respond with understanding rather than self-punishment. Consider a real-life scenario where someone forgets to respond to an important message from a friend. Later, they realize their mistake and immediately feel guilty. The internal dialogue might sound like, "I'm such a bad friend." However, if they apply self-compassion, they might instead reflect, "I feel regret because I value this friendship and I need to respond more attentively." This small shift transforms shame into awareness and opens the door for repair and reconnect rather than self-isolation. Rosenberg also highlights that self-compassion is closely linked to emotional responsibility. When we understand our feelings and needs without judgment, we are better able to make conscious choices rather than reactive ones. For example, a person who feels angry after a stressful day might usually react by blaming others or withdrawing. However, if they pause and connect with themselves, they might realize they are actually feeling exhausted and in need of rest. Instead of reacting impulsively, they can choose to rest, communicate their needs clearly, or take steps to restore balance. The chapter encourages readers to see their internal world as a space that deserves empathy rather than criticism. Just as empathic listening transforms relationships with others, self-empathy transforms a relationship with oneself. Imagine a person who is constantly pushing themselves to meet unrealistic expectations. Over time, they may feel burned out, anxious, and disconnected. If they begin to practice self-empathy, they start to recognize their limits, acknowledge their efforts, and respond to themselves with kindness. This does not reduce ambition. Instead, it creates a healthier and more sustainable form of motivation. As you listen to this chapter, reflect on how you speak to yourself during difficult moments. What is your internal voice like when you make a mistake? Do you notice patterns of self-criticism, blame, or harsh judgment? How would you speak to a close friend who was in the same situation? Why is it often easier to be compassionate toward others than toward yourself? Think about a recent mistake or failure. If you had responded with understanding instead of judgment, how might your emotional experience have changed? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice pausing before reacting to yourself negatively. When you notice self-critical thoughts, try to identify the underlying feeling and need instead of accepting the judgment as truth. For example, instead of saying, "I'm useless," you might say, "I'm feeling frustrated because I need support and clarity." This shift helps transform internal criticism into self-awareness and emotional understanding. Another useful practice is to regularly ask yourself, "What would I say to a friend in this situation?" and then direct that same compassion inward. Imagine how different your life might feel if your inner dialogue became more supportive and understanding. Instead of living with constant self-criticism, you would have an internal voice that helps you learn, grow, and recover from setbacks with resilience. Instead of being trapped in cycles of shame and guilt, you would develop the ability to understand your emotions and respond to them constructively. This shift can profoundly impact confidence, mental well-being, and relationships because the way you treat yourself internally inevitably shapes how you interact with the world. Ultimately, Chapter 9 teaches that self-compassion is not optional in nonviolent communication. It is essential. Rosenberg shows that we cannot consistently offer empathy to others if we are constantly in conflict with ourselves. By learning to connect compassionately with our own feelings and needs, we create the emotional foundation for healthier decisions, more authentic communication, and deeper relationships. This chapter reminds us that true communication begins within, and that the quality of our relationship with ourselves directly influences the quality of our relationships with everyone around us. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that self-compassion is essential for emotional health and effective communication. Many people habitually respond to their mistakes with harsh self-judgment, which leads to shame and discouragement rather than growth. By recognizing feelings and unmet needs instead of labeling ourselves negatively, we can transform self-criticism into self-understanding. To apply this chapter, practice pausing when you notice negative self-talk and ask what you are feeling and what need is connected to that feeling. Replace judgment such as, "I am a failure," with statements like, "I feel disappointed because I need improvement or support." Ask yourself, Am I treating myself with the same compassion I would offer a friend? What need is behind my reaction? How can I respond to myself with understanding instead of judgment? By cultivating self-empathy, you can build resilience, reduce emotional stress, and create a more supportive internal dialogue that improves both personal well-being and relationships with others. Chapter 10, Expressing Anger Fully, takes one of the most misunderstood human emotions and reframes it completely, showing that anger is not something dangerous to suppress or something that must be unleashed without control, but rather a powerful signal that can guide us toward clarity, truth, and unmet needs when understood properly. Marshall Rosenberg challenges a common belief that anger is caused by other people's actions. Instead, he explains that anger is never directly caused by others. It arises when we interpret someone's behavior in a way that disconnects us from our needs and values. This distinction is crucial because it shifts anger from something external and uncontrollable to something internal that can be understood and transformed. The chapter begins by addressing what most people do when they feel angry. In everyday life, anger is often expressed through blame, criticism, shouting, or silent resentment. For example, imagine a person whose friend cancels plans at the last minute. The immediate emotional reaction might be frustration, followed by thoughts such as, "They are so irresponsible," or "They don't care about me at all." These thoughts quickly intensify the anger, and the conversation that follows often becomes confrontational or cold. However, Rosenberg encourages readers to pause and look beneath the anger. Instead of focusing on what the other person did wrong, we are invited to explore what we are actually feeling and what need is not being met in that moment. One of the most important insights in this chapter is that anger is a secondary emotion. Beneath it, there is usually something more vulnerable such as hurt, disappointment, fear, or sadness. Imagine a workplace scenario where an employee is passed over for promotion. They might feel angry and think, "My manager's unfair and doesn't appreciate my work." But if they dig deeper, they might discover feelings of disappointment and a need for recognition, fairness, or growth. The anger is not the real problem. It is a signal pointing towards something deeper that needs attention. When the underlying needs are understood, anger begins to lose its destructive power and becomes a source of clarity instead. Rosenberg explains that expressing anger fully does not mean suppressing it or exploding without control. It means taking responsibility for the emotion and using it as information. This process involves 4 steps: noticing the stimulus, identifying the judgmental thoughts, connecting with the underlying feelings, and finally recognizing the unmet needs. While people often skip directly to blaming others, the practice of nonviolent communication invites us to slow down and work through these layers. For example, if a partner forgets an important commitment, instead of saying, "You are so careless," one might pause and recognize, "I feel hurt because I need reliability and consideration." This shift transforms anger from a weapon into a bridge for understanding. The chapter also explores how unprocessed anger can build up over time and damage relationships. Consider a family situation where a child feels repeatedly ignored by their parents. Instead of expressing their feelings directly, they may suppress their frustration. Over time, this suppressed anger can turn into resentment or emotional distance. Eventually, a small incident might trigger a disproportionate reaction because the accumulated anger has not been processed in a healthy way. Rosenberg emphasizes that expressing anger fully and honestly, as soon as possible, prevents this buildup and allows relationships to remain open and transparent. Another key idea in this chapter is that responsibility is central to transforming anger. Many people believe that their anger is caused by external events, but Rosenberg argues that it is our interpretation of those events that generates anger. For example, 2 people might experience the same situation differently. One person stuck in traffic might feel furious, thinking, "People are so inconsiderate," while another might feel calm, thinking, "This is frustrating, but I can use this time to listen to music or reflect." The difference lies not in the situation itself, but in the meaning each person assigns to it. This realization gives us power over our emotional responses. The chapter also highlights how expressing anger constructively can actually strengthen relationships rather than damage them. Imagine a scenario between friends where one feels hurt because the other repeatedly arrives late. Instead of suppressing the anger or attacking the friend, they might say, "I feel frustrated because I value our time together and need reliability when we make plans." This kind of expression is honest, vulnerable, and focused on needs rather than blame. It creates space for dialogue instead of defensiveness, and often leads to mutual understanding rather than conflict. Rosenberg also warns against the dangers of moralistic judgments when expressing anger. Statements like "you are selfish" or "you never respect anyone" tend to escalate conflict because they attack a person's identity rather than addressing specific behavior. Instead, nonviolent communication encourages focusing on observable actions and internal feelings. This shift reduces defensiveness and increases the likelihood of being heard. For example, instead of saying, "you ruined everything," a person might say, "when the plan changed at the last moment, I felt disappointed because I was really looking forward to it." As you listen to this chapter, reflect on your own relationship with anger. How do you typically express it? Do you tend to suppress it until it builds up, or do you express it immediately in a reactive way? When you feel angry, do you usually focus on what others did wrong, or do you take time to understand what you're feeling underneath? Think about a recent moment when you felt angry. If you had paused and identified your deeper need, how might your response have changed? What was the unmet need behind your anger in that situation? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice what Rosenberg calls taking a time out from blame. When you feel anger rising, instead of immediately reacting, pause and ask yourself what you are feeling beneath the anger. Try to identify the need that is not being met, such as respect, fairness, understanding, or support. Then express that need clearly instead of attacking the other person. For example, instead of saying, "you never listen to me," try saying, "I feel frustrated because I need to be heard and understood in our conversations." Another useful exercise is to reframe angry thoughts into feeling and need statements. Every time you catch yourself thinking a judgment like "this is unfair" or "they are wrong," pause and translate it into "I feel ___ because I need ___". This simple shift can reduce emotional intensity and create space for more constructive communication. Ultimately, Chapter 10 teaches that anger is not something to fear or suppress, but something to understand and transform. Rosenberg shows that when we fully express anger through awareness of feelings and needs, it becomes a powerful tool for clarity rather than destruction. Instead of damaging relationships, anger can actually strengthen them when expressed honestly and responsibly. This chapter reminds us that beneath every strong emotional reaction lies a human need waiting to be understood, and when we learn to connect with that need, we transform anger into insight, communication, and deeper connection with others. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that anger is not caused by others but arises from our interpretations and unmet needs, and it can be transformed into clarity when we look beneath it. Expressing anger fully means moving beyond blame and judgment and identifying the feelings and needs that are driving the emotion. To apply this chapter, practice pausing when anger arises and ask what you're really feeling underneath it and what need is not being met. Replace statements of blame such as "you always do this" with expressions like "I feel ____ because I need ___". Reflect on questions such as, what is a real emotion beneath my anger? What need of mine is not being met? Am I expressing my anger in a way that builds understanding or creates conflict? By learning to understand and express anger constructively, you can reduce conflict, improve communication, and turn emotional intensity into deeper self-awareness and stronger relationships. Chapter 11, Conflict Resolution and Mediation, brings together everything learned in the earlier chapters and applies it to one of the most challenging aspects of human relationships, resolving disagreement between people in a way that preserves dignity, understanding, and connection. Marshall Rosenberg explains that most conflicts are not actually about opposing positions, but about unmet needs that are hidden beneath emotional reactions, assumptions, and blame. When people are in conflict, they often become trapped in a cycle where each side tries to prove they are right while the other is wrong. But this approach rarely leads to resolution. Instead, it deepens division. This chapter introduces a radically different approach, one where the goal is not to determine who is correct, but to understand what each person truly needs and find a solution that honors those needs as much as possible. The chapter begins by describing how conflicts typically escalate in everyday life. Imagine two roommates arguing about cleanliness in their shared apartment. One roommate feels frustrated because the dishes are left unwashed, while the other feels criticized and misunderstood. The conversation quickly turns into blame, with one saying, "You are so careless and never clean anything," and the other responding, "You are obsessed with control and always complain." At this point, The actual issue, which is maintaining a comfortable and respectful living environment, is completely lost. Rosenberg emphasizes that in most conflicts, people are not hearing each other's needs because they are too focused on defending their own position. The mediation process introduced in this chapter involves shifting attention away from judgments and toward the feelings and need behind each person's words. A mediator, or even one of the individuals involved, can help guide the conversation by listening deeply and reflecting what each person is experiencing emotionally. For example, instead of allowing the roommates to continue blaming each other, one might reframe the situation by saying, "It sounds like one of you is feeling frustrated because you need cleanliness and order, while the other might be feeling overwhelmed and needing flexibility or support." This simple shift changes the tone of the conversation from confrontation to understanding. Rosenberg highlights that effective conflict resolution begins with empathy for both sides, not just one. A common mistake in disputes is that people try to prove their own perspective without acknowledging the emotional reality of the other person. However, when each person feels genuinely heard, the intensity of the conflict naturally begins to decrease. Consider a workplace disagreement where two team members argue about how a project should be completed. One prefers a structured, detailed approach, while the other prefers flexibility and creativity. Without mediation, this can quickly turn into a battle of personalities, with each side believing the other is wrong. But when both individuals are invited to express their feelings and needs, it becomes clear that one values clarity and predictability while the other values innovation and freedom. Once these needs are understood, it becomes possible to design a solution that incorporates both structure and creativity. The chapter also explains that mediation is not about compromise in the traditional sense, where both sides give up something and end up partially satisfied. Instead, it is about creative problem-solving based on needs. Rosenberg argues that when needs are clearly understood, solutions often emerge that satisfy everyone more fully than expected. For instance, in a family conflict where a teenager wants more independence and a parent wants more safety and control, the solution is not simply splitting the difference. Instead, it might involve agreeing on clear boundaries that provide the teenager with autonomy while still ensuring the parent's need for safety is met. This kind of resolution is more sustainable because it addresses the root concerns rather than just a surface disagreement. One of the most powerful ideas in this chapter is that conflict is often a result of language that disconnects people from their needs. When people say things like, "You are always disrespecting me," or "You never listen," they are expressing judgments rather than needs. These judgments create defensiveness, making resolution nearly impossible. However, when these statements are translated into feelings and needs, the door to understanding opens. For example, "I feel hurt because I need to be heard and respected," is much more likely to lead to a constructive conversation than a statement of blame. Rosenberg shows that the mediator's role is often to translate these judgments into language that reveals underlying human needs. Consider a real-life scenario in a community setting where neighbors are in conflict over noise levels. One neighbor complains, "You are constantly making too much noise and ruining my peace." The other responds defensively, saying, "I have a right to live my life and you are too sensitive." Without mediation, this conflict could escalate for months or even years. However, if both sides are guided to express their underlying needs, a different picture emerges. One neighbor may be needing rest, quiet, and relaxation, while the other may be needing social connection or freedom of expression. Once these needs are understood, they can collaborate on solutions such as setting specific quiet hours or finding ways to reduce disruption while still allowing normal living activities. The chapter emphasizes that successful mediation requires patience and a willingness to slow down the conversation. In heated conflicts, people often want immediate solutions or want the other person to admit they are wrong. However, Rosenberg argues that rushing toward solutions without understanding needs often leads to temporary fixes that do not last. True resolution happens when both parties feel fully heard and when their underlying needs are acknowledged. This process may take time, but it leads to deeper and more lasting peace. Another key insight in this chapter is that mediators must remain neutral and focus on understanding rather than judging or siding with one person. Whether the mediator is a professional or someone involved in the conflict, their role is to help each person express their feelings and needs clearly while ensuring that both sides feel heard. This creates a safe space where vulnerability becomes possible, even in emotionally charged situations. As you reflect on this chapter, think about conflicts in your own life. How often do disagreements escalate because both sides focus on proving who is right rather than understanding what each person needs? Can you recall a situation where a misunderstanding lasted longer than necessary because neither side truly felt heard? In your current relationships, where might there be hidden needs beneath recurring arguments? What would change if you focus less on winning the argument and more on understanding the other person's experience? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice becoming a needs translator in your own conflicts. When you notice a disagreement, pause and try to identify the feelings and need behind both your own words and the other person's words. Instead of reacting immediately to judgment or blame, reframe the situation in terms of needs. For example, replace "you never respect my time" with "I feel frustrated because I need reliability and consideration." This approach can completely shift the direction of a conversation. Another useful practice is to slow down conversations when emotions are high. Instead of continuing to argue, take a moment to reflect back what you think the other person is feeling. Even simple statements like "it sounds like you're feeling frustrated because the situation is important to you" can reduce tension and create space for understanding. Over time, this habit builds stronger communication skills and reduces the intensity of conflicts. Ultimately, Chapter 11 teaches that conflict is not something to be feared but something to be understood. Rosenberg shows that beneath every disagreement are human needs waiting to be acknowledged. When people feel heard and understood, the need to fight or defend themselves decreases, and cooperation becomes possible. This chapter reveals that mediation is not about controlling others or forcing agreement, but about creating connection through understanding. By focusing on needs instead of positions, conflict transforms from a battleground into an opportunity for deeper understanding and mutual respect. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that conflict arises from unmet needs rather than opposing positions, and resolution becomes possible when those needs are clearly understood and acknowledged. Mediation in nonviolent communication focuses on empathy, understanding, and translating judgments into feelings and needs instead of focusing on blame or who is right. To apply this chapter, practice identifying the underlying needs in any disagreement rather than reacting to surface-level arguments. When conflict arises, ask yourself, what are my needs in this situation? What might the other person be needing? Am I focusing on winning the argument, understanding the person? Try reframing blame-based statements into need-based expressions and encourage others to do the same. By consistently focusing on needs instead of positions, you can reduce conflict, improve relationships, and create more constructive and peaceful solutions in your everyday interactions. Chapter 12, The Protective Use of Force, addresses one of the most sensitive and often misunderstood areas of nonviolent communication, which is how to respond when safety, harm, or serious conflict makes immediate dialogue impossible. Marshall Rosenberg makes a very important distinction at the beginning of this chapter. There's a difference between the protective use of force and the punitive use of force. While punishment is used to make someone suffer for what they have done, protective force is used only to prevent harm and protect life, dignity, and safety. This distinction is central because it reframes the idea of force not as an act of violence, but as a form of care when used with the intention of protection rather than punishment. The chapter begins by challenging a common assumption that many people hold, which is that all force is inherently violent or harmful. Rosenberg explains that there are situations in life where immediate intervention is necessary, and in such moments, action may need to be firm, direct, and physical, but the intention behind it determines whether it is violent or protective. For example, imagine a situation where a child is about to run into a busy road. A parent pulling the child back quickly and firmly is using force, but the intention is not to punish or control. It is to protect life. In this case, the force is an expression of care rather than aggression. Rosenberg emphasizes that a protective use of force is only justified when there is an immediate risk of harm to life or well-being, and when communication is not possible or effective in that moment. Consider a role-life scenario in a classroom where a student is physically attacking another student. In such a situation, the teacher may need to intervene physically to separate them and ensure safety. However, the purpose is not to punish the student but to prevent harm and restore safety so that communication can happen later in a calmer environment. Once the immediate danger is removed, the focus can return to understanding the feelings and needs that led to the behavior. One of the most important ideas in this chapter is that protective force is always temporary and limited to stopping the harmful action, not the person. Rosenberg stresses that even in situations where force is used, the underlying goal remained connection and understanding. Imagine a security guard stopping someone from entering a restricted area. The guard may physically block entry, but the intention is not to humiliate or punish the individual. It is to maintain safety and order. Once the situation is stabilized, communication can be restored and needs can be explored. The chapter also contrasts protective force with punitive systems that are common in society. Punishment is often based on the idea that people should suffer for wrongdoing in order to learn a lesson. However, Rosenberg argues that punishment rarely leads to genuine understanding or behavioral change. Instead, it often creates resentment, fear, or further aggression. For example, if a child is punished harshly for breaking something, they may learn to hide their mistakes rather than understand the impact of their actions. In contrast, if the focus is shifted toward understanding needs and consequences, the child is more likely to learn responsibility and empathy. Rosenberg explains that many institutions, such as schools, workplaces, and legal systems, often rely heavily on punishment because it appears to create order. However, he challenges readers to consider whether compliance achieved through fear is truly sustainable or compassionate. Imagine an employee who follows rules strictly only because they fear being fired. While the behavior may appear correct on the surface, the internal motivation is not based on understanding or agreement, but on avoidance of punishment. This can lead to stress, disengagement, and lack of genuine cooperation. The chapter also explores how protective force can be used in everyday situations in non-physical ways. For instance, setting boundaries in relationships can be seen as a form of protective action. If someone repeatedly violates your personal space or disrespects your time, choosing to step away from the situation or limit contact can be a way of protecting your well-being. This is not about punishing the other person, but about maintaining your own safety and emotional health while leaving room for future understanding if possible. Consider a workplace scenario where an employee consistently behaves in a disruptive or harmful way toward others. A manager might need to temporarily remove the employee from a project or assign different responsibilities. While this action may feel restrictive, its purpose is to protect the team and maintain a functioning environment, not to shame or retaliate against the individual. Rosenberg emphasizes that even in such cases, the door for empathy and dialogue should remain open once safety is restored. Another key insight in this chapter is that the protective use of force should always be accompanied by clarity of intention. Without clear intention, force can easily shift into punishment or control. Rosenberg encourages readers to constantly check in with themselves when taking strong action by asking whether the goal is to protect life and needs or to punish and inflict suffering. This internal awareness is essential in preventing misuse of power. The chapter also highlights the importance of distinguishing between feelings of anger and the decision to use force. Anger often arises when we perceive that our needs are not being met, but acting on anger without awareness can lead to harm. However, when anger is understood and connected to unmet needs, it can guide protective action that is thoughtful rather than reactive. For example, if someone is being verbally abusive, stepping away from the conversation or ending the interaction can be a protective choice that preserves emotional well-being without escalating conflict. As you reflect on this chapter, think about situations in your own life where force, control, or strict action has been used. Were those actions aimed at protection or punishment? How did they affect the relationship afterward? Can you recall moments when setting boundaries helped protect your well-being without harming the relationship? How might those situations have been different if the intention behind the action had been more clearly focused on safety rather than control? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice pausing before taking strong action in emotionally charged situations and asking yourself whether your intention is protective or punitive. If your goal is punishment, consider whether there's another way to address the underlying need. If your goal is protection, ensure that your action is limited to stopping harm rather than trying to cause suffering. Another useful practice is to revisit situations after they have stabilized and seek to reconnect through empathy and understanding rather than leaving the conflict unresolved. Imagine how different many conflicts in life might look if force were used only to protect rather than to punish. Instead of cycles of resentment and retaliation, there will be opportunities for safety, reflection, and eventual understanding. Instead of fear-driven compliance, there could be clarity about boundaries and needs. This shift does not eliminate the need for firmness in certain situations, but it transforms the meaning behind that firmness. Ultimately, Chapter 12 teaches that the protective use of force, when used with clear intention and compassion, is not a contradiction to nonviolent communication, but a necessary part of it in certain situations. Rosenberg shows that protecting life and well-being sometimes requires immediate action, but that action does not have to come from anger or punishment. When force is used only to prevent harm and restore safety, it remains aligned with the principles of empathy, respect, and human dignity. This chapter reminds us that even in moments where words are not enough, our intention can still remain rooted in compassion and care. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that force can be used in a non-violent way when its sole purpose is to protect life, safety, and well-being rather than to punish or cause suffering. Protective action is temporary, focused only on stopping harm, and should always be followed by opportunity for empathy and understanding once safety is restored. Punitive force, on the other hand, often leads to resentment, fear, and disconnection. To apply this chapter, practice examining your intention before taking strong action, and ask whether your response is meant to protect or punish. In difficult situations, focus on stopping harmful behavior while avoiding actions that aim to cause emotional or physical suffering. Reflect on questions such as, am I acting to protect life and needs, or to punish someone? Is there a way to maintain safety while keeping the door open for understanding? What action would reduce harm without escalating conflict? By developing awareness of the difference between protective and punitive force, you can handle difficult situations with greater clarity, responsibility, and compassion. Chapter 13. Liberating ourselves and counseling others brings nonviolent communication to its most practical and transformative stage by showing how the entire framework can be used not only in conversations with others but also in moments of inner struggle, emotional overwhelm, and when helping others who are in pain. Marshall Rosenberg explains that liberation in communication is not just about speaking differently or listening better, but about freeing ourselves from habitual patterns of blame, guilt, shame, and emotional reactivity that keep us stuck in cycles of misunderstanding. At the same time, this chapter emphasizes that when we support others, we are not there to fix them or give advice immediately, but to help them connect with their own feelings and needs so they can discover their own clarity and solutions. The chapter begins by describing how most people, when faced with emotional distress either in themselves or others, tend to fall into automatic reactions. When someone is struggling, the instinct is often to give advice, correct their thinking, or reassure them quickly. For example, imagine a friend who says, I feel like I'm failing at everything in my life. A common response might be, no, that's not true, you're doing fine, or you just need to be more positive. While these responses come from good intentions, they often bypass the deeper emotional experience of the person. Rosenberg suggests that true liberation happens when instead of rushing to fix the situation, we help the person connect with what they are truly feeling and needing in that moment. One of the key ideas in this chapter is that liberation begins with awareness of internal dialogue. Many people are not fully conscious of the judgments they hold about themselves and others. These internal judgments often create emotional suffering. For instance, a person might think, I'm a failure because I didn't achieve my goal. This thought creates feelings of shame and discouragement. However, if that same thought is transformed into nonviolent communication awareness, it might become, I feel disappointed because I value achievement and growth. This shift does not deny responsibility or avoid reality. Instead, it transforms self-judgment into self-understanding, which opens the door to constructive change. The chapter also explores how we can use NVC to liberate ourselves in moments of emotional intensity. Imagine someone who has just received criticism from their manager. Their immediate internal reaction might be self-blame or anger toward the manager. Rosenberg encourages readers to pause and move through the 4 components of NVC internally, observing what happened without judgment, identifying feelings, recognizing needs, and then formulating a clear request for oneself or others. Instead of spiraling into thoughts like, I am incompetent, the person might realize, I feel discouraged because I need clarity and support regarding expectations. This inner shift reduces emotional turbulence and brings a sense of grounding. Another important aspect of this chapter is learning how to support others without taking responsibility for their emotions. Rosenberg makes it clear that helping someone does not mean solving their problems or absorbing their pain. Instead, it means being present with empathy and guiding them toward their own awareness of feelings and needs. Consider a situation where a colleague is overwhelmed and says, "I can't handle this workload anymore." Instead of jumping in with solutions like, "You should talk to your boss," a more compassionate response would be, "Are you feeling overwhelmed because you need more support or balance in your workload?" This type of response helps a person reconnect with themselves rather than becoming dependent on external advice. The chapter also highlights that people often carry deeply ingrained patterns of thinking that keep them stuck in emotional suffering. These patterns include blaming others for their feelings, suppressing emotions, or identifying themselves through negative labels. Rosenberg shows that by consistently practicing NVC, individuals can gradually break free from these patterns and experience greater emotional clarity and freedom. For example, someone who constantly thinks, "People always ignore me," might begin to shift their awareness toward, "I feel lonely because I need more connection and acknowledgement in my relationships." This transformation does not immediately solve the external situation, but it significantly changes the internal experience and opens possibilities for meaningful action. Rosenberg also emphasizes that counseling others using NVC is not about being an expert or having the right answers. Instead, it is about presence, listening, and reflecting feelings and needs in a way that helps the other person hear themselves more clearly. Imagine a parent whose child is upset after losing a competition. The parent might instinctively say, "It's okay, you did your best." But the child might still feel misunderstood. A more empathic approach would be to say, "Are you feeling really disappointed because winning was important to you and you wanted your effort to be recognized?" This helps the child feel seen and understood, which is often more healing than any advice. The chapter also addresses the importance of self-empathy when we are helping others. Rosenberg explains that if we are not connected to our own feelings and needs, we may become emotionally drained or reactive in conversations with others. For example, if someone is expressing anger toward us, and we take it personally without awareness of our own feelings, we might respond defensively. However, if we stay grounded in self-empathy, we can recognize our own reactions, such as feeling hurt or defensive, and then choose to respond with clarity instead of reactivity. As you reflect on this chapter, think about how you typically respond when someone shares emotional distress with you. Do you immediately try to fix their problem, or do you take time to understand what they are feeling and needing? When you experience emotional discomfort yourself, do you tend to criticize yourself or explore your deeper needs? Can you recall a recent conversation where advice was given too quickly instead of empathy being offered first? How might that conversation have unfolded differently if deeper understanding had been the focus? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice pausing before responding in emotionally charged situations and silently asking yourself what the other person might be feeling and needing. Instead of rushing to solve the problem, try reflecting their experience back to them in simple language. Another powerful practice is to apply NVC inwardly whenever you notice self-critical thoughts. Instead of accepting those thoughts as truth, translate them into feelings and needs, which helps shift from self-judgment to self-awareness. Imagine how your relationships might change if you consistently responded to yourself and others with this level of awareness. Conversations would become less about defending positions and more about understanding experiences. Emotional distress would become an opportunity for connection rather than conflict. You would no longer feel responsible for fixing other people's emotions, but instead feel present with them as they discover their own clarity. At the same time, your internal world will become less harsh and more supportive, allowing you to navigate challenges with greater resilience. Ultimately, Chapter 13 teaches that liberation through nonviolent communication happens both internally and externally. Rosenberg shows that when we free ourselves from habitual patterns of judgment and reactivity, we also gain the ability to support others in doing the same. Whether we are dealing with our own emotions or helping someone else through theirs, the key is to stay connected to feelings and needs rather than getting lost in blame or advice. This chapter reminds us that true healing and transformation come not from fixing people, but from creating a space where understanding, empathy, and self-awareness can naturally emerge. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that liberation in communication comes from transforming internal and external conversations through awareness of feelings and needs rather than judgment or automatic advice giving. True support for others means helping them connect with their own emotions and needs instead of trying to fix their problems. To apply this chapter, practice pausing before responding to emotional situations and focus on reflecting feelings and needs rather than offering immediate solutions. When dealing with your own thoughts, translate self-judgment into statements of feelings and needs to build self-awareness and reduce emotional distress. Reflect on questions such as, am I trying to fix a situation or understand it? What feelings and needs are present in myself or the other person? Am I responding with empathy or with advice and judgment? By consistently practicing awareness and empathy in both self-reflection and communication with others, you can experience greater emotional freedom, stronger relationships, and deeper understanding in all areas of life. Chapter 14, Expressing Appreciation in Nonviolent Communication, explores what genuine gratitude looks like when it is freed from habit, obligation, flattery, and social performance, and instead becomes a conscious expression of life-affirming connection between people. Marshall Rosenberg explains that appreciation is not just about saying polite words like thank you, but about deeply recognizing the specific actions of others, the impact those actions had on our lives, and the feelings and needs that were fulfilled as a result. In this sense, appreciation becomes much more than a social nicety. It becomes a powerful form of communication that strengthens relationships, builds trust, and nourishes both the giver and receiver on a deeper emotional level. The chapter begins by pointing out that in everyday life, appreciation is often expressed in very shallow or automatic ways. People say things like good job, nice work, or thanks for everything. But these phrases, while well-intentioned, often lack emotional depth and clarity. They can even feel empty if they are not connected to real awareness. Rosenberg suggests that when appreciation is expressed in a vague or generalized way, it may not fully reach the other person or reinforce a connection that exists between them. Instead, he encourages a form of appreciation that is grounded in specific observation and authentic emotional experience. For example, imagine a colleague who stays late to help you complete a project. A typical response might be, "Thanks, you're amazing." While this sounds positive, it does not fully express what actually happened or how it affected you. In nonviolent communication, a more meaningful expression would sound like, "When you stayed late yesterday to help me finish the report, I felt relieved and supported because I was feeling overwhelmed and needed collaboration to meet the deadline." This kind of appreciation does something much deeper than praise. It connects the action to real human feelings and needs, making the appreciation more sincere and emotionally impactful. Rosenberg explains that authentic appreciation has three essential components. First, we clearly observe what the person did without exaggeration or judgment. Second, we express how we feel as a result of that action. Third, we identify the need that was fulfilled. When these three elements are combined, appreciation becomes a form of honest emotional sharing rather than social performance. It allows both people to see the real value of the interaction, not just in abstract terms, but in lived human experience. The chapter also highlights how appreciation in this form benefits not only the receiver, but also the giver. Many people assume that gratitude is something we offer to others for their benefit alone, but Rosenberg emphasizes that expressing appreciation deeply enhances our own emotional state as well. For instance, when a person takes a moment to reflect on how a friend's support helped them feel safe during a difficult time, they become more aware of their own needs for connection and care. This awareness increases emotional clarity and strengthens a bond between people. Consider a real-life scenario involving a parent and child. A child might help clean the house without being asked. A typical response might be, "Good boy," or "Well done." While positive, these responses do not explain what was meaningful about the action. A more NVC-based appreciation might be, "When you helped clean up without being asked, I felt really grateful and relieved because I needed support in managing the house, and your help made me feel like we are working together as a team." This kind of expression not only reinforces behavior, but also helps the child understand the emotional impact of their actions in a deeper way. The chapter also warns against a subtle danger in how appreciation is sometimes used. In many cases, praise can unintentionally create pressure or dependence on external validation. When people are constantly told, "You are great," "You are perfect," or "You are the best," they may begin to rely on external approval rather than internal awareness of their own actions. Rosenberg distinguishes between evaluation-based praise and needs-based appreciation. While evaluation judges a person's character, genuine appreciation focuses on specific actions and their impact without attaching labels to identity. Another important insight in this chapter is that appreciation becomes most powerful when it is expressed immediately and sincerely, rather than stored up for rare occasions. Many people wait for special moments such as birthdays, anniversaries, or achievements to express gratitude. However, Rosenberg encourages making appreciation a natural part of everyday communication. For example, telling a friend, "When you listened to me earlier today without interrupting, I felt really understood and calm because I needed space to express myself," can strengthen connection far more than occasional general compliments. The chapter also emphasizes that receiving appreciation can sometimes be as challenging as giving it. Some people feel uncomfortable when others express gratitude toward them, especially if they are not used to hearing their actions described in emotional terms. Rosenberg suggests that learning to receive appreciation with openness is just as important as learning to give it. When someone expresses gratitude, instead of deflecting it with, "It was nothing," we can simply receive it and recognize a connection being offered. As you reflect on this chapter, consider how you currently express appreciation in your daily life. Do you tend to use general phrases, or do you take time to describe specific actions and how they affected you? How often do you connect appreciation to your actual feelings and needs? Think about a recent moment when someone helped you or supported you. Did you express your gratitude in a way that fully captured the emotional impact of their action? How might your relationships change if appreciation became more detailed, intentional, and heartfelt? One practical way to apply this chapter is to practice the 3-step appreciation format in everyday interactions. The next time someone does something meaningful for you, pause and identify what they specifically did, how it made you feel, and what needed fulfilled. Then express it clearly and sincerely. Even small moments, such as someone holding a door open or offering a kind word, can become opportunities for deeper connection when expressed in this way. Another useful practice is to intentionally look for one moment each day where someone's action made a positive difference in your life and express appreciation for it in detail. Imagine how different your relationships might feel if appreciation was not occasional or superficial, but a regular and meaningful part of communication. People would feel more seen, more valued, and more connected. Instead of relying on assumptions or general praise, relationships will be strengthened through clarity and emotional honesty. At the same time, you will become more aware of the many ways others contribute to your well-being, increasing your sense of gratitude and connection to life itself. Ultimately, Chapter 14 teaches that expressing appreciation in nonviolent communication is not about social politeness or praise, but about recognizing life-enriching actions and connecting them to real feelings and needs. Rosenberg shows that when appreciation is specific, heartfelt, and grounded in awareness, it becomes a powerful force for deepening relationships and enhancing mutual understanding. This chapter reminds us that gratitude is not just something we say, but something we experience and share in a way that brings people closer and strengthens the fabric of human connection. Main points and actionable lessons. The central lesson of this chapter is that true appreciation is not vague praise, but a clear expression of what someone did, how it made us feel, and what needed fulfilled. This form of gratitude strengthens relationships because it is specific, honest, and emotionally meaningful. To apply this chapter, practice replacing general compliments with detailed appreciation that connects actions to feelings and needs. When expressing gratitude, ask yourself, what exactly did the person do? How did it make me feel? What need was fulfilled? Also reflect on whether you are expressing appreciation regularly or only on special occasions. By making appreciation more conscious and specific, you can deepen your relationships, increase emotional connection, and create a more positive and supportive communication environment in your everyday life. And that brings us to the end of this journey through nonviolent communication, where we explored how shifting from blame to understanding, from judgment to awareness, and from reaction to empathy can completely transform the way we connect with ourselves and others. We learned that true communication is not about winning arguments, but about recognizing feelings and needs, that anger can be understood rather than acted out, that conflict can become cooperation when needs are seen clearly, and that even appreciation can become a deeper form of connection when it is expressed with sincerity and awareness. If you found value in this audiobook summary, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel Visual Books, and sharing it with someone who could benefit from more mindful and peaceful communication in their life. Your support helps grow this channel and allows more people to discover powerful ideas like this. And don't forget to check out the full book for an even deeper understanding of transforming the way you communicate and relate to the world.